Welcome to Flat, Cool, and Acid-Free, an OK State Archives podcast, bringing you stories about Oklahoma State University and Oklahoma. On this episode,
began to develop around it. People began referring to it as the central building. So this little area here in the southeast corner was the first kind of quadrangle for the campus.
We take a look back at the establishment of Stillwater and its land-grant university. Then, Samantha Mackey, Archives digital storytelling intern, and David Peters, head of the University Archives, takes us through the first 25 years of OSU. Homesteaders arrived in Payne County in 1889 to untamed land of tallgrass prairie. The prospect of a new township brought opportunities for infrastructure, schools, businesses, and a future home for a land-grant university and agricultural experiment station. On December 1st, 1891, James C. Neal, appointed director for the Agricultural Experiment Station, and several local citizens marked the Hatch Act funds were used for building construction, while the Morrill Act funds were for acquisition of equipment and teacher salaries. Rectangular in shape, 50 feet in length and 30 feet wide, the Experiment Station Barn, known as the Horse Barn or College Horse Barn, was the first building on campus to be raised in the spring of 1892. By fall of that year, the prairies that once blanketed the land were now orchards, vineyards, pasture, and field trial lands. During the development of the Experiment Station, classes had already begun. December 14th, 1891, the first classes were held temporarily in the Congregational Church. Samantha Mackey and David Peters chat about the Oklahoma State University's first 25 years.
The land rose in 1889. By June of 1891, a Board of Regents has been formed and a site committee has been selected to locate the college here in Stillwater. It wasn't until November that they were able to transfer the deeds of land to the new Board of Regents. And so by December 14th, 1891, they began to bring students together for registration. There's no buildings on campus. There's nothing on campus. They registered here in Stillwater, and they began classes in that day. They met several locations. They met at some of the local churches that had gone up in the 2 years since the community had been founded. They even met in some of the stores downtown. And then occasionally they would meet on campus for classes. If there was an outdoor activity, they would meet on campus. But December 14th, 1891. I might mention, we never really celebrated that date until President Bennett came along, over 40 years, almost 40 years later. And he felt it was important that the college began to recognize an anniversary date. And so they selected December 14th because that's when classes started. But it also just happened to be Henry Bennett's birthday. And so the two were celebrated from Bennett's whole tenure as president. They celebrated his birthday and the founding of the college on December 14th.
So, David, we're here in Old Central. Can you tell us a bit more about this building?
So I mentioned the $10,000 in bonds that the citizens of Stillwater had to come up with. There was a few hops and skips along the way, but eventually they got the funding approved. But then there also needed to be matching funds from the territorial legislature, and those matching funds were also about $10,000 to $15,000. By about 1893 or so, things were becoming more secure, and they began planning for construction of what they called the Assembly Building. It was going to be located initially where we think, where the center of campus at that point was where the library is now, the OSU Edmonds Library. And that's where they originally were going to plan on putting this Assembly Building. But the citizens of Stillwater were so upset that it would be so much further for their students to have to walk that they wanted it closer to the southeast corner. And so it ended up being at the location we are right now in the southeast corner of the campus. There were 4 other wood frame buildings that had gone up between 1892 and 1893 before they started planning for this new assembly building. And so those were used temporarily. But in 1893, they finally get approval. They think they have the funding in hand, and they begin construction in 1894. 1894 was an election year, and the political parties switched at both the national level and the state level. The national level, the president determined who many of the state territorial officials were, and so they had to reappoint all the territorial governors, all these territorial officials. And so that created a bit of a bind, as some of the older territorial officials were holding on to some of the revenues, not freeing them from bank accounts, and new guys were trying to get the money. 1896, they finally get the building completed. So it took them about 3 years to complete the building. They finished it by June of 1896, just in time for the first graduation ceremonies in which we had graduates. They'd had commencement programs beginning in 1892. Every year they'd have in May a commencement program. They just had no graduates. But they wanted the students to get into the routine of an end of the year ceremony. But by 1896, they've got Old Central, or the assembly building at the time, in a good enough state that they hold up in the auditorium on the second floor the first graduation ceremony. We have 6 graduates that year. But remember, I said it was called the assembly building. Then it was called the college building for a while. And then as other permanent structures began to develop around it, people began referring to it as the central building. And so this little area here in the southeast corner was the first kind of quadrangle for the campus. And it was the central building. And for the buildings that still are around from that era, like Morrill Hall, faces in towards Old Central, Bartlett Center, faces in, all the buildings faced in towards Old Central. That they saw that as the center building. As it got older, it became Old Central.
After Old Central was built, how did the rest of campus begin to take shape?
Well, funding was always an issue, but as they got additional funds, they began expanding. They included, there was a engineering building, which was just west of Old Central, that went up by 1898, 99. A power plant went up at the same time. There was a science, I think they call it the chemistry building. These were mostly west of us, west of Old Central now. But they would just add these structures as funding became available. But it took them a long time. By 1906, which is the end of the territorial period, they finally get the money for a Morrill Hall. But as buildings were needed, they would come up with the funding. Initially, most of the buildings were agriculture related, and so we had a number of barns, either on the center part of campus or further to the west, where the agricultural experiment station developed, on the remaining part of the 200 acres. So there are agricultural facilities and then engineering facilities, which were kind of critical at that time for a lot of the activities that they were working on and classwork they were doing. But other science and other buildings came online. But Old Central initially was the home for both labs, classrooms, office space, for the experiment station, offices, the assembly area on the second floor. Originally it was all purpose, and as those purposes expanded, or the population expanded of the college, they began building other structures around it.
So we have a question from William. He'd like to know if there were any student groups in the early years of the university.
So the first students we talked about enrolled in December 14th of 1891. Most of them didn't have any kind of high school credentials. They'd just moved to this area within the previous 2 years. They either came from communities where they hadn't finished high school, or they had no credentials, and Stillwater didn't have schools right away first. And so over half the class that first enrolled were put in what we called the sub-freshman class. And so they had to take a year of kind of preparatory classes to see if they were up to college grade level. So you have to think half of the students are in this preparatory program, and the other half of the students are kind of college-bound, college curriculum. But students almost initially, at the very beginning, began forming small groups. And there was a Signal Literary Society. It was both men and women. They would meet and discuss literature, and there were musical performances. They would sing both vocal music, and there were certain. I know one gentleman had a guitar, and so he would accompany them on guitar. There was instrumental production. It was the Signal Literary Society was one of the first student groups. Usually they formed around interests, and so there were sports groups. Each of the classes would have a football team and a baseball team, and they would have class track meets, so the sophomores would run track against the freshmen, and so you'd had these interest groups. And then as the academic curriculum developed, there'd be a group of Aggies in the agricultural college. There'd be engineers, from engineering school, and so they developed by their interests, and kind of clubs formed. So it was a kind of interesting time, and really it was a way for people to socialize. There's no cell phones, there's no TV, and this is a way for people to interact, play bridge, and sometimes these student groups would be entertained by some of the faculty, and the faculty would sponsor many of these groups. So faculty, if they had a certain idea that they thought would be beneficial for students to come involved with, they'd get a group organized and then work with that group of students. So there was a lot of interaction between the citizens of Stillwater, between the faculty, and then these interest groups on campus by students.
Anthony would like to know if there are any buildings or structures left from territorial times other than Old Central.
So there's Old Central, and the only other one that still exists is Morrill Hall. Morrill Hall was completed in 1906, right before statehood in 1907. There was a bit of a controversy with it too. The federal government had cut off funding for new construction. Actually, the state had cut off funding for new construction until the state had been officially approved, in part because Guthrie wanted to make sure it retained the capital in Guthrie. They didn't want Oklahoma City stealing it. So they said no more construction. Well, our president at the time worked with his brother, who was a senator from Kansas, to get funding from the national government to go ahead and build Morrill Hall. So they built it, completed right before statehood. Eventually, Guthrie has its capital stolen anyway to Oklahoma City. But it did delay that process a little bit of time. But Morrill Hall is the only other building from the territorial period that still exists on campus today.
We have another question from Christopher, who'd like to know if Theta Pond was actually used as a watering hole for horses while students were in class.
So Theta Pond is a man-made pond. There was a real issue with having a regular water supply on campus in the early years, and that was a lower part of the campus, and so that water then served as they didn't pull water directly from the pond. What they did is then they dug several wells a certain distance from the pond. Now that the water table had been raised, they're able to pull water from those wells that had been filtered through natural soils and stuff. It also served, though, as a runoff place from a barn that was built north of there. It's one of the reasons why people claim that Theta Pond area is so fertile, because it was a runoff from the barn. There wasn't mixing the water supply with the drinking water with the runoff, but it was used as a watering location, and early on, various herds. We had beef and horse and sheep. The pigs were never there that area, but cattle, horses, and sheep would water at Theta Pond, and students, I guess, would be going to class. It wasn't that unusual at the time.
Since OSU was founded as a land-grant college, were there any specific requirements the college had to follow?
So the land-grant mission really was to provide a public education to as many people as possible. So your average citizen now could go to college, where college had been really kind of restricted to an economic elite before that. In doing so, they still wanted to maintain the standards in literature and kind of a classical education, but they wanted the experience and the educational experience to be in applied areas, and so that's why many of them have A&M, agriculture and mechanical. They wanted to be applied disciplines, so that Oklahoma, which is mostly an agricultural state at the time, it still has strong influence in agriculture, but most of the population lived on farms. That they would have an opportunity to learn how to manage their agricultural resources better. And so there's these applied programs in agriculture and there's applied programs in engineering. Once again, we have very little infrastructure in this new state, and so we want people to learn how to build bridges and roads and construction, for all the institutions that develop within the state. And so they want it to be applied knowledge, and so that's what kind of makes the land-grant mission unique. One of the requirements, however, was they had to provide military training, and that was kind of a little, other colleges weren't mandated to have military training, but as part of land-grant mission, they did want to make sure there was military training. You have to remember, the Morrill Act of 1862 is occurring right in the middle of the Civil War, And so I think they wanted to have people trained in military tactics and expertise. And so that was one of the kind of the few different things was military training. Initially, we made the mistake of thinking both men and women need to be involved with the training. And so for a while, our women students were also doing drill and marching, and then came a clarification from the federal government. No, we actually just need for the men to do that. Now, later on, women joined the military. We had an early inclusion of women in the military long before the others, but it was a mistake on our part.
And if I wanted to learn more about the first 25 years of OSU, where could I look for access to online collections?
So, well, let me mention several that are online. And so there was a series done at our Centennial, the Centennial History Series. I think it's over 25 volumes, and there's a lot of early history in those volumes. And those are available online. If they go to the library website or digital collections, Centennial History materials, they can see those online. So they can see those from anywhere. The early yearbooks beginning in 1910 are also online, and the early college papers, some of which were produced by these literary societies, were more of a monthly literary publication, but those are also available online. And so they can see all those without having the archives. But we'd love for people to come visit us, and we do have unique materials in the archive related to the early years of the institution. We have the first college catalogs that tell you a lot about costs and facilities and the people involved. We have Jessie Thatcher Boss collection. Jessie Thatcher was the first female graduate of OMC. 1896 was the first year of graduates. She graduates the next year in 1897, where she was with the second class. There were only 3 in her class. But we have her collection, which includes even her notes from her classes, her drawings that she submitted for some of her projects. And so it's a really kind of a fascinating collection of material. So we have a number of early day collections related to the college and a large number of photographs in the early years, many on glass linen slides. And so there's quite a few things that we can help people find, and some they can find online, and some they have to come visit us, but we'll be glad to work with them at any time.
Interested in hearing other library podcasts? Listen to Amplified Oklahoma, a monthly podcast brought to you by the Oklahoma Oral History Research Program. Amplified Oklahoma, telling stories about the people of Oklahoma. This episode highlighted a segment from the Archives Live, a monthly video broadcast on the Archives Facebook page. This episode featured Samantha Mackey and David Peters and was produced by Nina Thornton. Theme music is It's a Process, composed by Ben Stone and Finley Green, and published by BBC Production Music, PRS.